So we have one system, which is the old banking and financial system, which is on this side. That's the dead past. We bury that. On this side, we have a new system. How do we make the transition? And how do we make it globally? Because it's a global problem. And you cannot have prosperity in part of the world and the rest of it going to hell. You must reorganize the planet as a whole. And there is a mood for that, as you can see, of many nations around this world right now. So that's what we're going to respond to, and that's what we're going to address. Now, there are three parts to address. First of all, with the help of John Segerson and his co-conspirators, we'll have some maps, which I'll get into very shortly, which I'll take pretty much in the order they have them to simplify the way in which this runs. Make it a lot easier to get the job done. And if there are imperfections in the order, don't worry about it. You'll get the general idea. These maps are going to be used again, and diagrams are going to be used again with more amplification for a number of publications. So we're not going to try to give you the whole shebang now, but just give you a sense of what we're going to do and how it's going to work. The basic thing, we're going to have to use public credit. Since you cannot get private investment when private investment has gone bankrupt, in order to create large-scale projects of employment, you have to rely entirely on public credit. And I would suggest that we use the general rule, which is probably an acceptable general rule in the world today, that the public sector in economy is essentially infrastructure, government regulation of banking, which is really part of the infrastructure, the way we used to have bank regulation, and currency regulation. The government is responsible to protect the currency. Foreign trade, interstate commerce. Those are the government's functions, essentially, in our country and similar in other countries. But the most essential characteristic of the government responsibility for economy lies in general, basic economic infrastructure. Transportation, large-scale water management systems, the development of adequate power systems, education, general education, public health, the provision of public health facilities through which the private physicians work in order to provide a health care system which is adequate for the needs of the nation, and general public education, of course, and science. The government must specifically promote science in ways which are typified, for example, by the NASA project of the 1960s, or the middle 1960s, before they began to take it down. That we should employ, perhaps globally, about 5 to 10% of the population of the labor force should be employed in scientific endeavors today if we're going to continue to generate sufficient technological capability to meet the overall needs of this planet and its population. This will be clear as we go along. But the essential thing is this, which leads right into the maps. And then we'll get into this question of creativity. The one area internationally in which you can organize a global explosion of real economic growth is in public infrastructure building of nationwide as projects which are an extension of international projects, typified by the idea of a high-speed, preferably magnetic levitation rail system for freight as well as passengers, reaching from Brest in France on the Atlantic coast, by way of Paris, through places such as Berlin and Warsaw into Moscow, and on to places such as Vladivostok, down into China, across the islands down into Japan, and across the Bering Straits down into the United States and South America, of course. Now that is a characteristic project, which was a project which was proposed by two statesmen at the end of the last century. One was a protege of Pope Leo XIII, who was really the first modern pope to recognize modern society, and a protege of his in France, who was Gabriel Anatole, the French foreign minister, diplomat, and so forth, together with a great Russian genius who was the friend of a genius by the name of Mendeleev. And they organized this system of railroads to get the British out of China and to involve Japan. In about 1896, they had set up a nest of treaty agreements and other prospective agreements which would have done exactly what I just outlined in terms of rail development, except from that standpoint. The British caused World War I in order to prevent that cooperation using Venetian methods. And they got a Teddy Roosevelt in the United States who was not loyal to the United States. And they got an outright traitor and disgusting person, Woodrow Wilson, and that was the end of the United States for this century. And people like that. So these kinds of projects which require international credit cooperation to create, which are rail projects, large-scale water projects, we'll get into some of this and show you what this involves. These kinds of things are the key to world recovery, to getting to the other side of the river, across the river of chaos, from this side, which is doom, to the other side, which is survival. On the other side of survival, the transition through projects begun now, at least in germ form, continued with the idea we will expand them under the new system. And that's the way, through this kind of public financing, through international cooperation, to get a revival of the world economy, including the private sector as a whole. Look at the map again. And let's turn to the map. Now let's look at the kind of world we have to organize. John, start with the Eurasian continent. I can't see it from here. Oh, okay, good. And now, you've got to look first of all at physical geography. Just imagine you're coming from a foreign planet. You're planning to colonize the Earth. This is what you'd look at, wouldn't you? At Eurasia. And you would say, well, we got to fix that for human habitation. And fixing an area for human habitation, the first step is what we call infrastructure. So now you can look at Europe, which is an area we'll focus on. Europe includes the center of this whole project. We've got another area which is called East Asia, which is centered around China, Japan, and so forth. And then you've got, I got South Asia that got in there somewhere, or that's not, all right, fine. And now let's look at the Middle East. Yeah, it's fairly good, which we've got a third project. So we've got three projects. One is what was called some years ago the Triangle Project, the Productive Triangle Project, which I proposed to my wife in our discussions, by phone at the time, regrettably, in 1989, and she got other people organized to do, and we produced a proposal for this general kind of development. And that's number one. And three parts of this. Part number two, which is what we called then, back in 1983, was called the Pacific Indian Ocean Basin Development Project, which I wrote up a report and published a lot of material on then, which involved China, the island rim of East Asia, involved subcontinent of Asia, involved the east coast of Africa, involved the Middle East, of course, which is there, and the west coast of the Americas. This entire area, which includes Australia and New Zealand, is within a body of water, the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And if you look at the surface of this area, the water surface, you will find that India is very much ocean-bound. India, which has about, the Indian subcontinent, which has about 1 billion people or so, has 1/3 the area of the United States, and a lot more sea in terms of inland, in terms of total acreage or total square miles. The amount of coastal miles are very high. So that very slight development, that essentially India is a maritime civilization by modern technological standards. The coastal area of China, similarly, and if you had an inland water development system, water-made development system in China, then you would have, at the same time, you would have the ability to move your infrastructure development into the deep interior of China. You add a modern rail system to China with a tight grid, and suddenly now China essentially can function very effectively in respect to its ocean surface. And China becomes then a maritime nation in this degree, in its relationship between India, its relationship with the Americas, its relationship with Australia and Southeast Asia, becomes essentially a maritime relation. East Africa, the same thing. East Africa is a part of this area logistically, and therefore the development of this area in its infrastructure, particularly with a maritime orientation and inland waterways and rail systems from the coast inland, that is the essential characteristic of this thing. Now, the East Asia and South Asia part are linked to Europe in two ways. The primary way is from China and Japan and the Bering Straits through Moscow into Western Europe. That aspect of the thing is what we call a Eurasian Landbridge, typified by the upgrading of the railway system, the Trans-Siberian Railway System, in which the China development of rails, and there are two Silk Road rails, one which is the one that goes up and intersects through Kazakhstan, the Trans-Siberian Rail, and one going with a more southerly route. And these become, China then becomes an inland role, has an inland role in respect to Europe through a rail and inland waterway system. And India comes in under the same thing. We have a third area which is crucial. And let's look at the Oasis Plan Zone. I think you have that there is one under A51. Okay. Now, the key thing here, as you can see, is this area, first of all, can be characterized as the crossroads of civilization. In the earlier history of mankind, the Middle East was the link between the Mediterranean civilization, which was European civilization, and the Indian Ocean. And thus that's the crossroads of civilization. It has two significances. First of all, it is vital that we have peace in this area for two reasons. First of all, the Perez-Rabin-Arafat peace plan is necessary, is something I've worked for over 20 years, and actively with them and with both the PLO and others, and on the Arab side and with Israelis on the Israeli side. And finally, it looks as though it's being done. It's not yet successful. We intend to make it successful. But this crossroads of civilization is also a paradigm for the principle of cooperation based on common interest, which we hope to make more general throughout the planet. Now let's look at the political maps and look at this from a political standpoint. The reason it's necessary to look at these things from the standpoint of maps is that what ordinarily people do in economic statistics is a fraud. That, for example, let's take the case of the four Gulf states, southern Gulf states. If you take the average figures, because of some air bases and other things in that region, it will show you that about 4 beds per 100,000 in that area, hospital beds, which looks fairly high compared to most of the country. But you ask Amelia or other people who come from that region, and they will tell you that actually it's a disaster there in terms of hospital access, that the nearest hospital may be 100 miles or more away from the person who needs the treatment. Say, for example, in childbirth care. A woman's coming into childbirth, she has a problem, can she get to a hospital? Well, it's 100 miles or so away. And she has presently probably no official connection to that institution or the people who practice there. So therefore, there is no hospital bed available for this woman. And that's the characteristic throughout a lot of the country. So when someone gives you, well, the average bed per capita, hospital beds, or the average number of physicians per capita, or so forth, or anything else per capita for the United States, that really doesn't mean much. For the person who is sick, or the person who has to buy food, the person who has to get to school, the question is of the actual availability of that facility to the person where they live and where they work. Another thing, for example, which is, you recall from the history of the United States, the deregulation of trucking and rails, which wiped out whole communities in the United States. Because if you cannot have competitive and reliable freight delivery at reasonable prices, to an area, a local area, you cannot sustain a competitive industry in that area. Therefore, the industry goes bankrupt. It has to close up. It can't compete. Because the trucks that used to come there go to Cleveland or Chicago. They don't go out in the boondocks, except at premium rates and on irregular schedules. So therefore, when you say the average amount of employment, the average number of workplaces in the country, that doesn't mean much. How many industrial workplaces do I have in East Oshkosh or some town 50 miles outside there? That tells me what the development of the country as a whole is. You take, for example, the case of Nigeria. For years, Nigeria inherited the British system, the colonial system. Therefore, the port city of Lagos had most of the infrastructure of Nigeria. The result was that all of the industries which wished to get into Nigeria or develop there would have to rely largely upon the port city of Lagos. Lagos became an overflowing city like Cairo or Alexandria, which the number of people in that congested areas was impossible to maintain because we didn't have the infrastructural services to sustain that kind of a population and that kind of concentration. So therefore, the development of the entire country was held up because there was not sufficient internal development of the internal aspects of Africa, and Nigeria in particular. So therefore, looking at figures, at data, and taking averages or other ordinary statistical measurements is essentially a fraud. The way to look at data, and we can do it now because computers have become cheaper and they've improved, as we're seeing here, in a sense. Take any map of the world, divide it into its political elements, consider its landscape, its physical geographic characteristics, whether you've got an ice flow on top of it or not. It's hard to plant crops with a glacier on top of the soil, unless you're planting ice cubes. And look and put your data down in the cell area, some little local part, maybe 1/10,000th part of a degree of latitude and longitude or something like that. Stick your data where it belongs on the map. Put your population figures where the population occurs. Locate the hospital. Don't take the average hospital. Put your hospitals where they are on the map. Study the relationship of the people in that area to the hospital in that area. Put your physician population on the map similarly. Put your industry on the map. Put your transportation system on the map. It looks much different than when you take the averages. Therefore, that's why we're using maps. And now we have the technology at a price which is competitive, shall we say, and we can now do this properly. But in planning the development of infrastructure in particular, locations of industry, development of nations, look at the map. And people have to be geometry and map literate. Well, you got the Eurasian continent now again on there, right? All right, we divide the thing into three areas, Eurasia, because Eurasia represents, in this case, the greatest part of the human population. Most of it's there. We've got over 1 billion people in China. You've got over 1 billion people in the subcontinent area. You've got close to 400 million in Southeast Asia. You've got Japan with about 150 million, so forth and so on. And you look then the European population. That's most of the human population. Furthermore, as you'll see a little bit later, this is the area of the world in which the greatest number of people are underutilized. Therefore, if I can take the people of China, who are still largely a peasant population living on a marginal level of existence, if I can provide those people and the people in India who are still living mostly at a coolie level, the people of Southeast Asia, can make available to them to the modern technology which will immediately begin to improve their productivity and standard of living, I have the greatest growth in rate of total world production possible simply by concentrating on Eurasia. And if I have a system such as the Indian Ocean Pacific Basin system, which is developed, there are some of the figures, the population. You now get a picture of what this China, India, Japan islands section is, including Taiwan, what the potential is here. You get a similar picture on India and that part, and Southeast Asia, which is your basin part. You add the East Africa part, You add the contact of the United States, Canada, and South American and Central American countries, their interface with the Pacific Ocean, that's part of it. So therefore you have most of the world's population is involved in these three areas: the European extension, the Asian extension, East Asian extension of the Pacific Basin to the land bridge, and the crossroads of civilization in the Middle East. For example, in the Middle East, what's that? Well, the Middle East is a port area. You have a port area of sorts in Aqaba. You have a port area at Gaza. If you have a canal running from Gaza to Beersheba to dump salt water down through a tunnel into the Dead Sea to raise the water level, that canal to Beersheba is now an inland waterway which moves salt water and barges in as far as Beersheba from Gaza. If you link that canal up with a canal cut down to the Gulf of Aqaba, you now have a Red Sea, Dead Sea, Mediterranean link. If you use desalination, the canals bring the salt water to places where you want to locally desalinate for fresh water. And my proposal is to produce enough fresh water by desalination in that region to equal the current annual flow of the River Jordan. It's like adding another River Jordan to the region. And you overcome that water shortage, you put the power installations in and the transportation systems. What have you got with a couple of ports? You now have, in that area, places where ocean vessels are coming to the Mediterranean and through the Indian Ocean to a port areas where they can be serviced, as vessels often require service, and where a great number of different kinds of intermediate and semi-finished commodities are coming together in a port area. Now, if you're an enterprising man in business and you found a part of the world in which this port area is receiving a great assortment of kinds of raw materials and intermediate products and semi-finished products all in the same place, you say, well, I'm going to set up a factory there. Because there I'm having at the cheapest cost ocean freight delivered to my doorstep all the raw materials and semi-finished parts that I need to make things. So rather than have these raw materials go on, say, to Europe or someplace else to be processed there, why don't we process them here? Because when I process them here, then when I ship them further, the transportation costs are now a smaller percentile of the costs of the whole production than they are if I move them directly to Europe. You say, well, this is great economic advantage. And now we have it on the Gaza side. So that what happens is you not merely put people together and given them a chance to do some economic development and cooperation in the region, but now you have created, by this kind of development, you've taken desert land, you're making desert land useful land for humanity. Now, the gopher-loving environmentalists may be upset about that, but I think that's a good thing. You also have created not only economy within the region, but you've created a function which is useful for the planet as a whole economically, which these people can perform for humanity generally. And thus, you've created the basis in which the Middle East does, in fact, economically function as the crossroads of civilization, as we would hope under these kinds of developments. So therefore, we have the three areas we define as primary in Eurasia. The eastern section, which has two aspects. The Asian section, which comes in with the Pacific Ocean Basin, Indian Ocean Basin, which is also connected to the European Triangle land bridge. We have in the Middle East, which is somewhat cut off from these two areas, we have the Middle East development based on the Israeli-Arab-Jordan peace agreements, which then becomes the basis for a crossroads of civilization development, which participates in world development in that way in this area. And that will get this going. Now, we divide this thing quickly into a number of zones. I'll just describe this because it has some bearing on the theory. The rest of these things which John and others have done will show up in various publications shortly and will also be available in a short period of time for those of you who are doing replays of this descriptive outline in regions in various parts of the world and in the United States. One area we call primary, and let's just go through these quickly to see what we mean by that. the primary land bridge development zone, which is 1.2100 under A, which he'll get on there shortly. He's got it all in the machine there so you can see it all. I think it's important that some of these maps be shown so a sense of familiarity, a tangible sense of what we're talking about. Okay. So you have Central Europe. Now, Central Europe, we mean France, we mean in the Netherlands, we mean Germany, we mean part of Czechoslovakia, what used to be Czechoslovakia. That is primary. Now, that involves a triangular area from Paris to Vienna and up to Berlin approximately, whose historic significance is that especially since the time of Charlemagne, about 800 AD, that this part of Europe has been subjected to, as you'll see in a short time, we could take it now, but it's get him out of order there. There's some problems with this. The greatest development of, first of all, canal systems. When you look at the inland waterway system, I'll give an example. Just recently, while I was in the jug, something I wanted happened. They finally completed the link of a canal system which links the Rhine to the Danube through the Main connection. And an old enemy of mine, Taxis, who died, probably of his sins, was holding it up. But that was completed. Now you can move a barge from the North Sea, and if you get by the Serbian gunships, you get it all the way into the Black Sea. And it affects all the area in between. You look at the map of the inland waterway system of Central Europe, from France down to the Mediterranean in France, through Germany, now down to the Danube system, down toward Eastern Europe. Then you look at the water system in Eastern Europe, in Poland and the other Eastern European countries and Russia, and you find it's not there. Now, next to ocean-borne freight, bulk transport by barge is the lowest cost per ton and other costs for transporting materials. The only problem with the barge system is the canal system cannot go where rails and roads can go. You can't go with that depth. And you need things transported a little faster than barges will do it. So for bulk freight or stuff that you would warehouse anyway, and you don't care if it takes a little longer to get there, you would prefer to have it moved by barge because you have greater economy for the entire society. Also, the canal system gives you a development potential in the areas where the canal goes. It means these areas are development areas, where otherwise they may not be developable. They also are very good because when you maintain the aquifer system, which canals help to do, you are also benefiting everything generally. So if you look in Eastern Europe, the part that was formerly under Soviet domination, or Southeastern Europe, when you get beyond Slovenia and Croatia, particularly in the rest of the Balkans, then you look at Russia, and you look at China, you get a sense of the terrible underdevelopment of rail and water systems. You cannot have modern economic development without inland waterways, together with water management programs, and inland railway systems. The cost of moving goods by truck, the absolute social cost, vastly exceeds by a large multiple the cost of moving the same goods by rail. So in a rational society, you have rail systems which are operating efficiently in as great depth as this is economical. Then you have an efficient transport of goods from rail to truck and from truck to rail over short hauls by roads into the local points that are not serviced by rail. So you have this combination of ocean freight, inland waterways, rail systems, and supplementary highway systems. That is the cheapest and best way to build the transport infrastructure for the economy. Air travel comes in, but is marginal for freight relative to the other means. If we build the new kinds of ocean-going vessels, which we can build, which are high-speed, which use this hydrodynamic method of propulsion as opposed to the screw propeller propulsion, we can get up to speeds of up to 40, 50 knots much more conveniently, even higher. In that case, we will bring the transport by ocean freight into competition with air freight. Not at quite the same speed, but in terms of economic effects for freight as such. So now, the other thing, of course, is you look at the general water development. And I think we can probably jump ahead to these statistics at this point, John, because I'm running long here. And this will just go in the publications. This will be, obviously, we've got the makings of a book report here, which you're seeing the samples of. So let's look at some of these rail, canal, and water development programs. Are they in? No, they're not. Some of them are not. Do we have the we have the physical geography, the land bridge rail development, and the that'll give some indication of it. We also have other ones which will be available. They're not in here. Okay. The 2003, huh? The land bridge development. And then on the second one, on the physical geography map, just to give some indication of this. That'll be coming up in a minute. But in any case, as you map it, then there's an overlay on this of the rail development. There's another one which is more details. Oh yeah, this is coming in there, good. The red in this case, I believe, if according to my specifications, is the proposed new systems, or maybe they didn't get to that differentiation. But in any case, the depth of rail, that's that. And water development. Consider one of the parameters of economic growth is the increase in cubic meters or cubic feet of water required for human consumption and industry per person, per household, and per square kilometer of land area. When I say per person, I'm generally referring to labor force per capita. You can measure production in terms of per capita of the labor force. You can measure consumption of households, if you have a good demographic model, of the standard consumption of households. You measure the overall effects in terms of land area. And you get the consideration of the amount of water required by households, per person, and per square kilometer of land as you increase technology. And thus, without power, because the same thing happens with power, in order to have more productive people, you must increase the power available per capita of labor force, per household, and per square kilometer. For example, in the household, you may not require the television set, at least most of the time. Some people have banned it from their house in defense of their children's minds. But you do require labor-saving devices. The great point about liberation of the woman in the household who's a child-rearing, has children of young age, who requires a mother present. There's no way getting around that. You just cannot. There's no way of fooling with that. What you have to do if you want to have good child rearing and you have children who are trying to cope with modern technology, you don't want the kitchen and the other routines to consume the energies and time of this woman who's a mother to these children. You want to make her work more efficient, and you do that by labor-saving devices. Now, I'm a somewhat older person, and I remember the way we used to do the laundry with one of these old machines. And we also had scrub boards too, you know. We used to boil shirts. The dress shirts were boiled in a big thing on the stove. It was a coal stove. We had an old laundry machine, which was a big tumble, looked like a big industrial device, which cranked away for a great deal of time. Hanging out the clothes, which are very heavy when they're wet, as some of you may know, particularly the sheets and so forth, is quite a strain, particularly when the winter time comes up in New Hampshire, so forth. Yeah. Kind of an unpleasant experience. You have to go out and beat the ice off the laundry before you take it in. So that these kinds of things are absolutely indispensable, labor-saving devices in the home. And this all involves an increase in the power consumption by the home, which is a good thing. Those people who are trying to conserve power, save on power, they're crazy. You should use power intelligently. You shouldn't run up the electric bill just to have a kick, But the point is, we should be using more power because we're saving what is precious, human life. A woman who's tied up unnecessarily in doing dishes the old way or laundry the old way, that woman has a life which is being shortened by this process, and she's better giving involvement if she's a mother with those children, or if she's doesn't have children, she has other activities, and she's better involved doing that than being tied up with the routine of menial housework. And therefore, in order to improve the standards of living, you do that. Now, if you look at architecture over the thousands of years we're able to see samples of it, you find that architecture has not changed too much. That generally it still takes two parents of the opposite sexes to produce a child. Some people have other ideas, but they're not going to work, I can tell you that. And that means that you have quarters where the parents are in one quarter. They require privacy for the children. Children require privacy of sorts to retreat, to concentrate on their projects. And therefore you would say, well, you generally need a bedroom for every child. So a child has a place to have privacy. You need functional areas in houses. When you do these things, it costs more money or costs more effort. It requires more power. And as Leibniz said in 1671 in his Society and Economy, you cannot separate the required standard of living from the level of technology and productivity of labor. You cannot pay the laborer on the basis of his being an individual person who must be supported. You must support the laborer's family, because the laborer is going to die of old age or something else, maybe overworked or underpaid. And you are going to depend to keep society going on his children. So the cost you have to pay is the cost of producing him by his family, his cost of his wages in maintaining a household and producing and rearing the children. And if you want to have children who are qualified for more advanced technology tomorrow, you've got to have a level of culture, which means also material culture, in the household which permits that to happen. If you underpay people, you're undereducating them. You're destroying them. And therefore, these kinds of considerations have to be taken in that way. Power, more power for production, greater energy flux density. As you go to the equivalent of higher temperature or higher frequencies and so forth, in the kind of power you require to deal with new technologies. Which, for example, when we go into space, as I've said before, we would mine the moon for helium-3. Therefore, for space travel, which is not going to take 2 years and so forth, a round trip to Mars, by chemical rockets, which is rather silly, involves all kinds of problems. You don't want to have a thermonuclear fusion generated propulsion system, ion propulsion system. That requires fusion process. Helium-3 exists in abundance on the moon. The sun has been depositing there for billions of years, so the moon's loaded with the stuff. And you have to put that stuff in your craft, which has some weight. So you have a ratio between the amount of propulsion you can get at certain accelerations and the amount of fuel you're burning, which means that if you're depending upon what you can carry in a ship to make a round trip, you find there's a limit. The laboratory for a long time. We know some of the physical parameters of these reactions, and we can say in general that the impulse to mass ratio of a matter-antimatter reaction, whatever it is, will be about 1,000 times greater, or 3 decimal orders of magnitude greater, than a hydrogen-3 system. And therefore I put some priority in trying to develop that thing, because I think it would be nice to be able to take a round trip. I won't do it, but maybe some of your grandchildren will. Take a round trip to Pluto and see what it looks like up there. At essentially at 1g acceleration, deceleration. I mean, so it would be a fairly short weekend trip, I think. You can do that. Just calculate. Anytime you get a calculator, calculate what a 1g acceleration, what the speeds that leads to, and what the distances are you have to do. It's great fun. So in any case, that's the general problem. Now we consider developing power stations, developing water projects, developing rail systems, particularly the magnetic rail systems, developing the transport systems and roads, subsidiary roads that go with the transport system, and utilizing to the maximum the degree for agricultural development and industrial development and construction development along the way. We also decide that the right, this is where Clinton is absolutely correct, the right, universal right to health care, to needed health care. We have to provide that not only for the United States, we have to provide that for the world. That requires an infrastructure. We're going to build it. We need universal education. That requires some infrastructure. We've got to supply it. We've got to build more cities out in the rural areas or towns which can expand into cities. We've got to bring industry closer to the rural area, especially in Africa, for example. It has to be done in China. You cannot develop China without bringing industry, not the Chinese people to industry in Shanghai, but industry to the Chinese people in whatever part of the country the family lives. You cannot have a system whereby you break up families when someone in a rural occupation goes 1,000 miles or 500 miles away to find a job in an industry. We know what that is in this country. We know the effects of that kind of thing. So this gives an impetus in the order of magnitude of trillions of dollars equivalent investment in infrastructure in Asia alone, which means you've got a fairly good perspective on keeping this investment going for some time. This amount of effort gives you the feedstock in credit to generate and regenerate industries along the way. You combine this with a new space program of the type we should be developing and some other research programs, and you have the basis for building and rebuilding this planet. And that's the new system in which we in the United States, by participating through the Ocean Project, by participating politically, by participating technologically, we can play a key part in that, in changing the world during the next century. Our main concern, however, and this comes to another subject here, the second principal one, and the third is just a comment, but the second principal one is now. I referred at some length and repeatedly as necessary to this concept of Imago Dei and Capax Dei, as they're called in Latin. The fact that the only thing that makes man, the only thing that makes man knowably, demonstrably, provably in the image of God, and the only means by which we can know with scientific certainty that we know and can prove the existence of God, is the demonstration in us of those powers of creativity which we associate with discovery, revolutionary discoveries of principle in mathematics and in physics. Now, what I want to do first of all is just indicate by something to which my wife somewhat objects, which I've used before, but I think is very indicative of what we mean by creativity, how you can locate it. Because I talk about creativity to people and they don't know what I'm talking about. They say they think they know what they're talking about, but they don't. You know what it's like, the teacher who knows that the student tells you they know what you're talking about, and you really know this poor little guy doesn't. And the problem is he doesn't want to admit that he doesn't know. So he's telling you some song and dance that he learned in the back of the book someplace. All right, let me take a popular subject. One farmer meeting a friend of his from the city, and the city fellow says, Henry Kissinger's a dog. The farmer says, no, he's a pig. Now, involved in this discussion between the two people, and they're both sane and they're both right in a way, is a demonstration of the principle of human creativity. So whenever you hear a farmer referring to Henry Kissinger as a pig, or perhaps to George Bush in a similar way, you know that you're dealing with a fellow who's intelligent, who's in the image of God. You can imagine a pig saying to a dog, no, Henry Kissinger's a dog, I'm a pig. And the dog responding in kind. But you know, pigs and dogs can't do that because they're not imago Dei. What's the point is, we know the person who's saying Henry Kissinger is a pig, and we understand exactly what he's saying. We know the man who's describing Henry Kissinger as a dog, and we know exactly what he's saying. We can say you're both right. The issue is that Henry Kissinger is an object on the one hand, which has the form of man. A pig is the form of a pig. A dog is the form of a dog. It's very convenient they keep these things necessarily separated. You don't get confused. These are sensory objects. These are mental objects which we derive from sense perceptions. When we come to the idea that Henry Kissinger is a pig, we have gone to a higher level of thought. What are we saying? We're saying Henry Kissinger is beastly. That he is a man who has the form of a man, but a behavior which would be considered tolerable only in a beast. And the question is he a rat, a pig, a snake, or whatever? Maybe an insect. Maybe bird food, should we say. So what we're doing in this case is we are communicating a different kind of an idea than a sense perception. We're communicating an idea, as a mental object. We're looking at an idea in the same way we would look otherwise at a sense perception. That obviously, what makes man different than the animal is man's ability to perform scientific and related operations to change human behavior, to make decisions which are based upon reference not to merely sense objects, but to mental objects. The crucial issue between the Aristotelians and the Christians over the past 500 years has been this issue. Or it's even older than that. It came up in the form of John Wenck's attack on Nicholas of Cusa some time before then. Beginning with people like Francesco Zorzi, the student of Pomponazzi, people like that, and Galileo, and Bacon, Francis Bacon explicitly, and all of the empiricists and all of the radical empiricists. They denied and opposed, as did Kant, denied the right of human beings to make decisions in terms of judgments based on reference to ideas which are mental ideas, like the idea that Henry Kissinger is beastly. And said you must come back always only to sense perceptions. That's the meaning of the word empiricism. Then radical empiricism said you must throw out all morality. That was in the middle of the century. That started with Adam Smith and people like that. You must throw out all moral considerations. You can't have moral considerations. You can only have, as Aristotle says, not moral considerations. You are not allowed to have them. You can have only ethical considerations. You want to read real evil. You read Aristotle's Ethics, which is dedicated putatively to his father Nicomachus, and his Politics. You want to see evil that reminds you of Henry Kissinger? There it is, Aristotle. You are not allowed to introduce morals into matters of public policy. Not morals as a list of do's and don'ts. That's not morality. That's childishness. But morality in the sense of principle. You can only have ethics, that you must premise everything upon nothing but sense perceptions in a form of calculation and relation which is modeled upon the arguments on motion by Galileo Galilei, who was a brainwashed zombie for the Venetians. Thus, the issue of creativity is the central issue of all policy. The Golden Renaissance was based on the notion of creativity, which is argued at some length in Cusa's De Docta Ignorantia and all the other writings. Plato's work entirely is on the subject of creativity. Most commentators on that, of the British school, the Oxbridge type, or of the Warburg type called the Marburg school, named after Warburg, the Cassira type. This is all garbage, complete fraud. That Plato deals entirely with the principle of hypothesis, and hypothesis means nothing other than a creative discovery of principle, which is a provable principle of discovery, change in the form of operations. This is human nature. This is the seat of morality. This which teaches us from our own experience that we're in the image of God. Take some other examples. I use in Germany, where the poem is well known, because Goethe, I used this years ago, back in the 1940s, early 1950s. Much of Goethe poems, which had been set to music by composers such as Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, and used that as a principle, as a standard of dealing with the problem of creativity from the standpoint of the arts. Now, Goethe is a very simple fellow. He's not a very profound person, but he does know what creativity is. And his short poems, especially his short poems and strophic poems, are models of creativity. And there's a poem called My Lied, which you can find out there. It's also in other literature, but let me just describe what the My Lied signifies. That the poem goes on, couplet after couplet. It's a fairly simple poem. Then the last couplet changes the meaning of the entire poem. This is called metaphor. When I am speaking of Henry Kissinger as a pig or a dog, I'm employing metaphor. Metaphor is not a form of literary elegance. Metaphor is a mechanism by which human beings communicate with one another about mental ideas as opposed to sense ideas. In sense object, I can point to a glass, I can point to this object, I can point to that object. So sense objects are essentially pointing objects. Mental objects you cannot point to except by setting up a situation and saying things like Henry Kissinger's a dog. You know what I mean. So I'm using this device of metaphor, Henry Kissinger's a dog, in order to point your attention to a mental object which exists in my mind, which my statement will help you to provoke in your mind. So now we both know what we're talking about. As the farmer knew when he said, no, Henry Kissinger's a dog, to the guy who told him in the city, Henry Kissinger's a pig. They both knew what they were talking about. So they could have a very interesting debate about this subject because they both knew what they were talking about. So instead of pointing by saying this noun means that object, the way we communicate mental objects is by structures in language which have the form of metaphor. For example, idiots would argue that the person who outlawed metaphor from the English language, Francis Bacon, was the author of Shakespeare's drama. Shakespeare's drama is nothing but the flow of metaphor, the thing that Francis Bacon explicitly outlaws. In music, the same thing. When there's a principle of development, and you'll hear some sample of this here, when you hear a spiritual which has been redone, an African-American spiritual, which has been redone as a folk song, in the same classical treatment which Brahms gave to folk songs in Germany, by the same method, what you're seeing is that the musician recognizes in a folk song a certain intrinsic beauty, which that musician is trying to bring forth in a richer way, in a way which is consistent with the implicit intent of the folk song. Therefore, he fixes it musically so that the metaphorical aspect of the poem is brought forth in the song. He actually improves the poem by a principle of development. The so-called principle of thorough composition in music, which is begun by the work of Haydn and Mozart at the beginning of the 1780s, which continues through Brahms and is picked up by Dvorak in this case of the African-American spiritual, is real classical music, not because it's old. Classical is not old. I'm not classical, I'm old. My mind is classical, and that's younger, right? Classical means based on a principle, a rational, creative principle of reason throughout. So that from the beginning to the end of a composition, there is a coherence, so that when the thing ends, if you know the composition, you realize it must end just at that point. The statement has been made. The statement of a metaphor has been made. In drama, take the case of any Shakespeare drama, or as Schiller analyzes drama in particular, including his own, the notion of Punktensalience, which Helga's been trying to teach people for years, is that at the point of a Punktensalience, the irony of a tragedy has been presented, just as I presented the irony of the 650 or 550-year tragedy, which is the death of this civilization. The fact that evil was able to parasitize upon the good, and that the people were unable to resist the evil sufficiently to get rid of it, dooms the civilization. The proposition that I've laid out to you of putting the old system into bankruptcy and launching a new system on the basis of an infrastructure development program under new credit principles, which are actually old ones, those of the founding fathers of the United States, or the founders of the Federal Republic. This is a Punktensalience. It is the idea which enables us to leap from the tragedy-ridden, bloody side of this side of the river to the other side of the river, which is not paradise, but the hope and opportunity for development. So when a drama comes to that point, a creative principle is posed, an implicit solution to the tragedy. The tragedy consists in the inability of the actors in the drama to bring the drama to a successful conclusion by applying that discovery. The power of tragedy lies is that the audience, which has been attentive, has realized at the Punktensalience that a solution existed. The audience then, from that point on, traces the failure of the principal actors to act upon that solution, and goes down to the end of the drama, the doom of all involved, because of the failure to act creatively on the solution to the problem. And thus all great drama, what does it do? If you go to a theater of a great, good performance, not in the Brechtian style, of a Schiller tragedy, you will come out of that drama as members of the audience better persons than you went in, because you have learned something about yourself and about society from that experience. The same thing is true in music. The same thing is true in great poetry. The same thing is true in great painting. Explain to me why, in Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Grotto, there are two sources of light depicted in that painting. It's an irony. It's a higher expression than Henry Kissinger's A Dog. It's a metaphor in painting. Great sculpture, great art, great photography, anything that is done well by human beings, which is based on a principle of rational, creative composition, to present a metaphor which communicates an idea to another human being in a creative way. That is the principle. Now, for example, let's take a simple example of what this principle means in practice. Let's take our schools. Throw the textbooks out, because the textbooks mostly lie anyway, especially in mathematics and physics. And have the children do what the students of the Brotherhood of the Common Life did, to go through a succession of experiences of discovery, to consciously re-experience the act of discovery of the people before us, thousands of years before us, hundreds of years before us, 100 years before us, on which modern civilization and ideas are based, so that the child can walk out of the classroom with a sense of having re-experienced the mental act of discovery of some of the greatest minds in all history before him or before her. Now, these minds, these musicians, these poets, these painters, these scientists, these theologians, live in that child's mind, like characters, as I said, in the School of Athens, in the Signatura, in the Vatican, or the famous mural by Raphael. They live in the mind. I have such people living in my mind. They're all over the place, a big crowd there. All of whom, whose thought and discovery I've re-experienced at one point in my life, and these are my conscience. These are my advisors, my committee of advisors. I must do nothing which is shameful in their eyes. They're watching me all the time. They're there. I created them. I brought them back to life by recreating the parts of their mental experience. And they're watching me. Everything I do, they criticize me constantly. They scowl at me. They make faces at me. They do. Therefore, that's what we want in education. We want the child to know all the aspects of life which are creative. Classical poetry. You don't tell them, say, we got to give equal time to bad poetry. We don't have to give equal time to bad poetry. Child wants bad poetry, they'll read it under the porch. Right? Music. A child should have musical development early on. It's very important for a child. A child should learn history, should learn drama, should learn all of these things. They should re-experience ancient people discovering what a solar year is, or some of that. So the child has a sense of education, not of learning a bunch of facts. The child has a sense of experiencing the creative activity of mankind. A child is living in the sense of man in the image of God, which man reveals himself to be only when he's being creative or loving in that special way that brings tears of joy to the eyes. What has happened to us, to our civilization, since the Council of Florence, is that the Venetians and their followers, the empiricists, the positivists, and so forth, have run a campaign typified by Pomponazzi, by Francesco Zorzi, by Francis Bacon, by Galileo, by Newton, by Locke, by Hume, by Adam Smith, by Jeremy Bentham, by Mill, by Norbert Wiener, by John von Neumann, etc., Bertrand Russell, etc., etc., have run a campaign to outlaw from the formalities of science and art any recognition of the actuality of the mental creative thought. That's the work of Kant. His critiques were all dedicated to that. That's the work of every empiricist philosopher. That's the work of John Dewey in education. That's the function of Howdy Doody. That's the philosophy of Bozo. Eliminate creativity. Facts, facts, facts. Calculate. Statistics. Facts, facts, facts. You have B.F. Skinner. Why did anybody ever allow B.F. Skinner to be put in any institution other than a mental institution? That mean-minded pigeon torturer. Why do they allow Watson to be treated? Why do they allow that man who doesn't even know what his own sexuality was, Sigmund Freud, to be treated as an authority? Why these frauds? Freud ran a hysterical campaign against creativity. He was a follower of this positivist Mach. He was a general evil-minded degenerate, albeit a clever one. Why do we allow this psychoanalysis to be treated seriously? It's garbage. Yes, some of it's very clever, and you should know about it if you're going to be serious about how things work in the society. But it's garbage. It's evil. It destroys people. We have a cat out there who's Doug refers to as the psychiatrist. He calls him Dr. Schwartz, the psychiatrist. Cat's the best psychoanalyst I've ever seen. He solves his patients' neuroses by eating them. The mice and the birds that are his patients. So the thing comes up in mathematics. You get absolute consternation, hysteria among scientists. You have people teach chaos theory. Chaos theory is nothing but this same stuff. The systematic denial of the existence of the act of creativity, the creative act which enables someone to recognize a conspiracy where one exists, or to recognize that Henry Kissinger's a pig. What we are going to do, I propose, is we're going to do something in the coming years as a continuation of what we're doing now, which will be one of the greatest acts in all history. Never before in history has a doomed civilization such as ours, and this is a planetary civilization at present, no other time has a civilization of ours ever come to an end without being taken over either by a dark age of some decades or centuries or by conquest. That if we were going according to averages, batting scores, we would say that this entire planetary civilization will end before the conclusion of this century, probably in a year or two. And that for a period of 50 to 100 to 200 years following, this whole planet will go through a dark age in which the level of population will fall to several hundred million people. That nearly everybody's family will be wiped out. There will be no grandchildren, no great-grandchildren, for most, for virtually anybody. Is that what will occur? I say this is an unacceptable prospect. And therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to do what has been hitherto impossible. And the way to do it is clearly before us, as I've described it somewhat today. We are going to build a bridge from hell into purgatory. A bridge from this side of the river, which is doomed, which is the plague land, the pestilence land, the AIDS society, into the other side of the river of chaos, which is a new society. Not a perfect society, but a new one. And we're going to do immediately, without missing a step. The way we're going to do it is by campaigning on the basis of the organization which has been mobilized to stop the Cairo conference. The conference is not about condoms or obstetrical needles, even though that's a minor subject, relatively speaking, in the conference. The major subject is whether the Venetian oligarchy, typified by Prince Philip and his family, has the right, through the Eugenics Society of the UN bureaucracy, through the World Wildlife Fund, the cannibals organization, to impose upon this planet a control of population in which the peoples of Africa have their populations controlled the way game wardens control a deer population in the United States or elsewhere, or the way Kruger Park was used to kill 100 million elephants were killed in the name of saving the species. A rhino population was reduced from 100,000 to 2,000 in the name of saving the species. And the game wardens sold the elephant meat to the miners. Right? And Russell Train, I understand, that was one of the big game hunters who killed the elephants to save the environment. Their objective is to reduce the human population to less than 700 million people. And they hope to secure, through a series of conferences, including the Cairo Conference, the Copenhagen Conference, the Beijing Conference on the Family, the ability to bring that authority through a supranational institution down upon mankind with the head of a pack of rats called NGOs and the UNO bureaucracy. There has been a global resistance to that. The Vatican organized a resistance. The Pope acted pretty much like Lazare Carnot. He got the cardinals out of the barracks and got the bishops over the other side of the river before morning. And so the Catholic Church as a whole with many parts with great reluctance. They'd much rather talk about condoms and needles than they would about fighting the Cairo Conference, or fighting the UN. He mobilized them. We, with our friends, work with other sections of society, including the work we've been doing with the Arab world and the Islamic world generally, to help get the message across to them. The Vatican had its own diplomacy, in a sense, with the Islamic countries, as we know in the case of Sudan, in the case of the Middle East, work trying to get peace there. So the Islamic countries began to line up against the Cairo Conference with the Vatican, with us. We've been attacked savagely by all the worst freaks and madmen of society, such as Conor Cruz O'Brien, because we're opposing this abomination. But today we find country after country is withdrawing from this Cairo Conference. It is not dead, the conference. Evil still exists, but we've impaired it. We have launched a counter-movement. That counter-movement must take a new form. And this is what I say is the only issue of any importance to any of us, at least any of us who are sane. All other issues are completely subordinate to this issue. We must mobilize the people of this planet for the kind of transition which I've indicated in rough outline here today. We must leave hell for purgatory. And we must begin to build the bridge to get there, sort of a new alternative to Noah's Ark. To get out of Sodom and Gomorrah and places like that. We must realize that what we've seen in the movement against the Cairo Conference is the expression of a global planetary potential for human beings to arise and say, we don't want this. We don't want any more Rwandas. We don't want the British colonial secretary, called Overseas Development Secretary, conducting mass genocide against Rwandans using the dictator of Uganda, who's our puppet, to do so. We don't want this. We don't want Lon Rowe in Africa. We don't want De Beers Oppenheimer anymore in Africa. We want these people out of there. We don't want them doing this to Mexico or Central America or South America. We want them out of there. We want these swine out of there now. Anybody who supports this stuff is not our person. They're not with our cause. They're the enemy cause. You want to talk about Nazi Germany? Well, let's talk about Hitler. Let's talk about who really put Hitler into power. Let's talk about who defended him until the war started, or virtually started. And the war was their purpose in putting Hitler in there. Let's talk about what was done after the war. About how a few scapegoats and a few innocent Germans were crushed, but the real perpetrators were never touched. Think about the word never again, which became a bad joke because nobody ever stopped the people who were prepared to do it again on a larger scale. The same Harrimans, the same Darwins and Huxleys in Britain, the same Morgans, the same Bushes, Prescott's son, George, who put Hitler into power before, who perpetrated that to which we said never again at the end of the war. They're doing it again. And they have a lot of people lined up behind them to support them in these ventures. As you can read in any newspaper or see, whenever you see Jane Fonda on the television screen. They're the other side. That is the enemy. Those are people who've gone over to the enemy. We don't wish to hurt them in any way, unnecessarily, but they're the enemy. And more important, what they represent, their ideas are the enemy. And we see in the Cairo Conference, in the projected Copenhagen Conference, in the projected Beijing Conference, we see the threat to perpetrate something upon the human race which makes the Hitler event seems mild by comparison. There is a mood in this world, as we've seen against the Cairo Conference, not only to stop that evil, but to say there has to be an alternative. And our job is to make that alternative clear and get people mobilized to start to build that bridge.